Hi, I'm Brent Johnson, and I'm here at St. Francis de Sales Oratory in South St. Louis. And with me is Chris Soer of Christopher Soer Pipe Organs, LLC. Chris, you are engaging on a reworking and sort of rebuilding of this mighty instrument right here. Is that true?
It's true.
Tell me all about it.
Well, St. Francis de Sales is a 1926 Wicks. It has been added to and altered throughout the past, pretty much its entire life, the past 60 years in particular, including a console from the 1960s. Some pipework was added in probably the 80s or 90s, and it doesn't match necessarily, but more importantly, things are failing mechanically. So it's operating on a lot of its original leather in the valves and also in the reservoirs, and it's of course failing. In fact, it's deteriorating very quickly because of the fact that in the wintertime it gets incredibly dry, and in the summertime it gets incredibly moist. So we're doing a lot to try to patch and repair, and in fact releathering pneumatics for valve actions. But also the relays are the original relays. I think Wicks may have added some new keying mechanisms at some point in time, but they're also probably 60 years old, and they're starting to fail, and some repairs had been made that are not necessarily up to code and also not necessarily the best, and so trying to remove some of that so that way we can get it to operate at its optimal even in its condition.
Now, this is a Wicks organ, has direct electric action. It's still running on its original action, correct?
It does.
You mentioned pneumatics, though. Are there pneumatic leather action pieces in here to work with?
There is. Before Wicks discovered what they called the balance valve, they had pneumatics that operated for the base pipes. Because the base pipes required a lot more wind than a little valve could handle, and it would require a lot of voltage and a lot of amperage, actually, and a rather large magnet to open a valve for a 16-foot, or in this case, a very large 16-foot open wood. So they would make pneumatic valves that had a direct electric primary for them. But St. Francis de Sales is probably the largest of this specific era of Wicks, the 1920s. It had a very distinct tonal design. It was before Wicks really had made a great name for itself in the 1930s with a different tonal design. So it's very 8 and 4 heavy. It's actually all 8 heavy, and most everything is unified 16/8/4. So it's a totally different design than what we would have expected from Wicks of the 30s and the 40s, when a lot of churches were building or having Wicks build instruments for them.
The organ is completely in these two cases up here in the gallery, and then we have some in the behind the front of the church, correct, as well?
Yes.
So what do we have in this side?
We have the grate division and the choir division. Tucked underneath the grate and choir is the top end of the pedal open wood, and which is a very large unit rank, 16/8 and 4 in the pedal. And then the base is to the grate trumpet, which goes down to 16. And then on this side, you have the swell division, and it's the swell division and the pedal borden, and that's the only thing on that side.
Right. So then we have the echo division, which is all the way back behind the altar. Is that correct?
Yes, behind, about midway up, there is a small, I would say 4-rank organ, but it's really cool. It has its own little mini console up front. And so you can operate it from this console, or you could have just played the organ up front. And it has dual switches in the console to turn on only the front blower or only the back blower if you wanted to. Unfortunately, that division hasn't played in probably 20 years because the blower, it doesn't work any longer, and the rectifier doesn't work any longer. And because it hasn't played that long, I'd imagine there's a lot of contacts that don't work any longer.
So is renovation of that division as well part of the whole project?
No, we're taking baby steps, trying to make it leak less and play more, a little bit at a time on the main organ.
Well, show us a little bit inside and we'll see what you're working on.
Sure. So this is the 16-foot borden, and I pulled all of the actions out for the base end. They have pneumatics, and so the leather was completely shot, and I'm releathering each one of the individual valves. They should actually return next week. We're heading into the swell box. You can hear the leak of the swell motors. it's a little bit dangerous getting in. So we're in the swell division, and you can hear the swell motors are leaking. They have individual pneumatics that open and close for each individual shade. Right now, I've got half of the trace installed so that all of the shades move together. We're installing new electric motors, and currently installing new electric motors. So the hope is to replace those and remove from operation this winded swell motor assembly, so that way we can actually have shades that work. Right now, maybe 3 of the expression shades work, and so the organist doesn't have very much versatility as far as expression is concerned. Tucked very, very, very tightly in this division is the open diapason, which this is scaled like a normal great division open diapason. It's ginormous. This here's the solitional. Then we have the aeoline. Underneath me here is a quintadena, which is an 8-foot quintadena, not a 16-foot quintadena. This is the labial oboe. It's a very interesting stop that Wicks made a lot of in this time period. The point is that reed pipes would go out of tune in churches that weren't climate controlled, and in the 1920s there were a lot of churches not climate controlled. So they wanted all of the flues to move together, and yet they wanted an oboe, so they tried to create it synthetically. It's a really great sound, but it sounds more like a flared gamba than it does an oboe. And then also deep down inside, it's not able to be seen, but there's a dip and a languid. And the next stop is the 8-foot stopped flute, stopped diapason. The next stop after that is the celeste. And then this was originally a cor anglais. Strangely enough, you had a labial oboe, and yet you had a kind of muted trumpet. It had been removed and sold a while back ago and replaced with this, which is a gigantic Gottfried cornopian. It's quite a brash and brassy sound, and the organist really likes it, and it's growing on me. It's quite a powerful sound in this very large room. And tucked up here is a vox humana. Someone removed the covers. I'm hoping to replace them at some point in time. It's also a very lovely example of a vox humana. The Wicks was building their own pipework during this time, but there's evidence throughout this organ that they might have been overwhelmed in some of this, because some of the clues that I have, that the diapasons are what you would expect of Wicks stamping, but the flatting is not normal Wicks style, and the inside has a bright pink sizing, which I've seen a few Wicks instruments of the 20s that had that bright pink sizing, but not a lot of them. So I'm not sure if it was just an experiment and it just happened to be during this phase, or if it was something that they ordered. The Wicks records are pretty complete, but they don't reference anything being purchased. A lot of times in their specifications they would say trumpet from out east, and it would refer to a supply company, either Gottfried, or they did a lot of business with American Organ Supply or Durst. In behind here is the relay.
This is all of the electronics, 1926 era, that control the organ, right?
Correct.
So what do we have here? What are all of these little
So
corpus?
each one of these magnets corresponds to a key on the console. This is the great division. And so when you press a key, the magnet will fire and ultimately touch all the little contacts there. But just firing the magnet doesn't actually play the pipe. This is where the stop action comes into play. When you pull a stop, the magnet turns on and allowing the circuit to be completed.
I see. So you have one of these switches that have 61 little wires on it for each stop. So if I turn on 2 of them, let's turn on the right one. And we get one of those for each one. So you've got a separate contact here for every key, and then on each magnet you've got a separate wire for each stop.
Correct.
So we have, just in the grate, we have 6 ranks And those are 73 note ranks.
Yes.
So that's 483 wires just on this top row that have the potential to break or do something.
Correct.
So what's down here?
So this is where the keys come in from the console to a junction, and then they go from here to the back of each one of these switches. So each one of these rows is a rank. This is the Doppelflute, this is the gamba, and this is the trumpet, and so on and so forth.
And these come from the console.
Correct.
So I noticed they actually are attached with little screws, so you could possibly detach the console easily and quickly if you needed to.
Yes, they made this really, really easy to install, that you could put the relay in as a cabinet, run the wires from the chest here and screw them in, and then run the console wires in and screw them in, instead of having to run individual wires and solder in each
Sit
place.
there and solder for hours on
Right.
end. Now, one thing I noticed, all of these wires are not covered with plastic, or rubber like we would use today, but instead they have cotton on them. How does that affect the process of working with this organ?
Well, double cotton covered cable is now illegal to install, and
It's not illegal to have it.
It's not illegal to have it, it's just illegal to install it or to work on it. So from what we understand of the code, I can work on a part that has the wire as long as I do not disturb the wires. If I have to remove the wires and then solder it back on, that's disturbing it. So in this case, we have all of these cotton covered wires that go for each one of the keys to all of the switches and then out to the chests.
And the main reason for that is that cotton just deteriorates over this many years and can cause a short circuit if two wires rub each other.
Right.
It would be protected otherwise.
And should the wire heat up, cotton will actually catch on fire, whereas the plastic will just melt.
And I should point out that this is not high voltage. It's not going to shock anybody if they touch it.
Right.
Wicks organs run on about 12 to 15 volts, and it's the amperage. If two wires get a short, it's going to cause some heat and will cause you fire, especially with cotton covered wiring. So that's interesting. In this phase of the repair, we're not replacing any of this. You're just going to get it working, and then hopefully someday in the future you'll replace this with solid state.
Correct. And the hope is to step by replacing from one point to the next. So if we work on the chest, we'll replace the chest cables. I'm replacing actions in the 16-foot Borden and then eventually in the 16-foot open wood, and the code dictates that when I disturb that wiring that I need to replace it then with plastic coated wire. So I'll rewire it to the same junction board here. And then eventually the hope is to replace all of this with solid state, but all of the chest cables will have been done at that point in time.
So this console here for the organ is not the original one.
Correct. It's a 1966 replacement. It's a typical Wicks of that era. It has plastic keys, but at least they're wood core, and they have the newer draw knob units of the time for Wicks. But it has been played lovingly for a very long time, and it is showing its age and wear.
It's pretty common on these older Wicks organs that the console is sort of the first thing to die. Even though the action over there is still playing away on most of it, the console is where the most activity actually happens. We have the most moving parts.
Right.
So this would have been typical in the 60s to come in and at least get the organ playing again with a new console and combination action.
Yeah, this console originally would have either been a horseshoe console, which is a lot like the organ that is at St. Alphonse the Rock Church, or it would have been two different side jams at 45 degrees, but with stop keys. But it would have been a very nice, handsome console, but again, it would have worn out because of a significant amount of use.
Chris, thank you for showing us around the organ today. I know we will be back to check on progress as this ongoing job continues, and I can't wait to hear the entire organ sounding again.
It's my pleasure, and I can't wait either.
Remember, you can always find streaming classical music anytime you want on our 3 stations, organlive.com, Positively Baroque, and the Organ Experience. I'm Brent Johnson, and I'll see you next time.